Hey, this is Tim Ash, President of the Vermont State Senate. A few weeks ago, I shared with you that about a half a block from my house, there had been a fatal shooting. In fact, I had woken up just before midnight to the sound of what I thought had been fireworks. It turned out they were gunshots. And at the time, I said, even during COVID-19 and this pandemic we're all going through, that our society's other ills don't just disappear. And seeing what happened to George Floyd in Minnesota makes that so very clear. And it's just such a heartbreaking experience because while this in some ways has catalyzed a lot of the protests we're seeing, it's just the latest experience, the cumulative effect of incident after incident after incident, which just highlight that something is so very wrong in this country, that people continue to face discrimination. In this case, it's because of the color of people's skin. Other times it's because of people's sexual orientation or gender or religious denomination. And I just, there's a moment where you sometimes step back and you want to reflect and say, first, how has it gotten so wrong? And I think there are a lot of things we can all agree have contributed to this multi-hundred-year legacy of discrimination, political process that often inflames the divisions between people, policies which have exacerbated racial inequality, whether it's in law enforcement, healthcare, housing, wages, you name it. They've all contributed. And then you turn to the question of, okay, we acknowledge the problem, what to do about it. And what's so very challenging in this moment is the expression of what's wrong is becoming clearer and clearer. And we have to now turn to the question of what to do about it. And the problem we're seeing all around the country is not something we're immune from here in Vermont. We have a disproportionate number of people of color in our correctional system. Traffic data, the traffic stop data, which includes the race of the drivers being pulled over, continues to show that if you're a person of color, getting pulled over happens with much, much greater frequency. And we see our own incidences here in Vermont. Right in downtown Burlington, not far from where I live, a young man was shoved up against a wall and knocked unconscious by a police officer and was dragged away. So we're not immune from what we're seeing around the country. I'll tell you a couple quick examples of how, despite the story we often tell ourselves in Vermont, we still have so much further to go. Back when Bill Sorrell was the Attorney General, I was invited to be part of a panel looking at implicit bias in law enforcement, and we traveled around the state and held hearings to hear from people in the communities about their experiences with law enforcement. In one of those hearings, a police chief actually said, "My department doesn't need to be trained in implicit bias because we know we don't have any," which is just such a shocking statement for so many reasons. Take a moment and think about that statement. But the signal sent by that particular police chief to his officers was that don't even worry about this as a problem. You don't have it. As if merely saying it made the problem go away. Another issue, body cameras. So there have been many of us in the legislature who have wanted body cameras to be on all law enforcement officers, both to protect members of the community from any potentially bad behavior from someone in law enforcement, and to make sure that law enforcement is protected, because then there's a video which tells the facts of what occurred at a particular moment, or at least largely tells the facts of what has gone on. 2 years after passing the legislation requiring it, guess what? The body cameras haven't been purchased by the state. And in some ways, we were surprised when we learned that they hadn't been purchased. But what was disturbing is last year, the state Commissioner of Public Safety wanted to use the money instead to buy rifles, not body cameras, while they continued to try to figure out some technical solution to data storage for body cameras. Now, I'm not sure what was going on in the minds of the Commissioner of Public Safety at the time, but it just speaks to the slowness of government in general, the community in general, to understand how serious the situation is for many people and why we need to do something about it and treat it as a more urgent matter. One of the things I've always been committed to is criminal justice reform, and I think the state in some ways has made some good progress. We have about 400 fewer people incarcerated today than was the case about 10 years ago. So that is a good thing. And because disproportionate number of people of color in our correctional facilities, the lower we drive down the number of incarcerated individuals, to the extent it's done proportionate to the race of the individuals behind bars, the criminal justice reform also has a racial justice component to it. But as I look at what's going on around us, it's really clear that the passing of laws, which is the job many of us do in Montpelier, we pass a law hoping to make things better. And what we often see is that we pass the law, we move on to some other thing, another problem that needs to be solved. And the thing that we hoped would happen doesn't happen the way we had asked, intended, desired. And so I think it's a moment where we not only need to have a broad discussion about where things stand in terms of racial discrimination in our state, especially in our criminal justice and law enforcement systems, but develop a plan to actually do something about it that's transparent and really works to root out systemic injustices. And that really begins at the very beginning with the first interactions that law enforcement has with people, whether it's when they're driving or not driving. We know that the traffic stop data indicates that people of color get pulled over far more frequently. We've heard the term driving while black. Well, that's a real problem here in Vermont. Some departments have been slow or even unwilling to provide clean data so that it can be put in and evaluated. And that's got to be put to a stop. But we need to drive down the levels of disproportionate stops and other first interactions with law enforcement until we know that you're no more likely to be pulled over because you're driving when you're black versus if you're driving when you're white. Then there's the issue of people who are, for whatever reason, arrested. The question is then, are the sentences being requested by prosecutors the same in both cases? Are the actual sentences that are settled upon fair and free from racial discrimination? When those occur, the treatment of individuals who are in the correctional system, are they treated without regard to race? Those are all questions which, frankly, I don't have great confidence that the answer is that we have rooted out racial discrimination in those systems. It's not true. We have not. We're in a position where we know we have a long way to go. And I think leveling with ourselves about the nature of the problem is the first step towards starting to do more, do something significant about it. I also want to say, I often hear people who say, oh, well, the number of people of color in the state is very small. Isn't it just a small number of people complaining or something like that? And I think the state's racial equity director, Xusana Davis, said it really well. She said, white privilege doesn't mean that your life isn't hard. It just means it's not made harder because of the color of your skin. And I think that was probably the best, most disarming statement I've heard about why every person who is white should not feel threatened about having this discussion. I hope that in this COVID moment where people, I think, have really returned to a sense of solidarity with one another and a real feeling of community, that it may very well present a moment where people can look past the normal political framework and say, you know what, we're all community members here, just like we were concerned with every community member's safety from being infected by COVID-19. We should, on a permanent basis, be concerned that people not suffer racial injustice. And so my hope is that here in Vermont, we will tackle systemic injustice in every step of a person's interaction with the state, at work, and in the community. And all of these things are not easy. These are all difficult discussions. They make us challenge our own way of thinking, challenge our own unconscious or implicit biases. But that's what it's going to take to get to a place where we have greater confidence that we have a society which truly treats people as equals. And I can't say that that is the way we do it now. We do not. So these are some unscripted remarks, just reflecting on the state of affairs right now. I was down at Battery Park this past weekend at what was a vigil and rally, and was very moved, particularly at the number of young people who have stood out and said they're not going to live their lives that way. They're not going to let our society be shaped by bigotry and discrimination. So that was one bit of hope I took from the experience. And hopefully those of us who are in a position to effectuate change will plant the foundation to allow them to live that way. Thanks.